and welcome. Many thanks for coming along on a Tuesday evening. There's other things you could be doing, of course, and great to get you to come along. You don't get many opportunities to hear Michael speak. He's based in France now. He'll be speaking on de-carbonising for growth. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Ian McGill. I'm one of two directors. Maria Balakard is the other of the University of New South Wales Centre for Energy and Environmental Markets. I've had collaborations with Michael, it must be almost a decade or something. This event really made possible by the Climate Change Research Centre, but also we've also been participating at the Centre for Energy and Environmental Markets and also AMOS, Australian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society as well. So thank you all for coming. My role is really to introduce the introducer for Michael, and that's Ian Dunlop. Now, I first sort of became aware of Ian Dunlop's work back in well over a decade ago now through his involvement with what was then the Australian Greenhouse Office Emissions Trading Working Group. And you may look at the current political situation here in Australia in despair, or at least wonder what happened. But back in 1998, absolutely globally leading work on emissions trading was being done here in Australia, with a particular series of 4 papers that were extensively used in Europe when they designed their emissions trading scheme. Ian was a senior executive with Shell. He was the chairman of the Australian Coal Association for a couple of years, 1987 and 1988. He did have this involvement in the AGO task force in the late 1990s, and I guess we might say that his life has taken new directions since his senior executive roles in the energy sector, involvement in the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, and Climate Safe Australia, and a number of other NGO and other roles exploring these questions of the future for Australian electricity industry in a carbon-constrained world. So most recently you may have seen he came even reasonably close to getting on the board of BHP Billiton, with a somewhat new message to take to the company's shareholders. And could you please join me in welcoming Ian?
Well, thank you, Ian, and thanks for the introduction to the introducer. It gives me very great pleasure to introduce Michael Molitor's talk this evening on decarbonising for growth. I think if you look around the world, in the developed world, the political and corporate incumbency is desperately striving to reboot the late 20th century economic growth model that supposedly has delivered increasing prosperity to us since the end of World War II. At the same time, they're even more desperately striving to ignore the implications of the resource scarcities and the other negative aspects that this model has actually produced as global population has moved from about 2 billion at the end of World War II to around above 7 billion today. And that, I think, the incumbency in this country in particular is probably doing more than anybody else to try and sweep those issues under the carpet. The problem is that none of this is basically working, because if you look at things like climate change in particular, it's quite clear that we now see very big changes occurring, even with the limited warming that has occurred at this point in time. And the need we have to start to reduce carbon emissions far more rapidly, I think, than is being talked about officially. None of these efforts are basically working wherever you look in the world. I mean, global growth is stagnating, despite enormous amounts of quantitative easing, so-called, and in large part due to the fact that energy prices stay stubbornly high, even in the midst of recession. On the warming front, I think as Voltaire said, men argue, nature acts. And it's patently obvious, I think, to anybody prepared to look objectively, that warming is occurring extremely rapidly, and that human carbon emissions, there's a very extremely high probability that they're in large part responsible. So what we're seeing is that we need really a new narrative to start to talk about how we handle this issue. We in fact have escalating risks if we want to avoid the real impacts of climate change. And those risks are now far, far higher, I think, than, as I said, that anybody's prepared to admit. But at the same time, we actually have enormous opportunities, provided we can get away from the paranoia of anything to do with deviating from the status quo of that high carbon growth model, and start to recognise that we're already seeing highly disruptive change happening all around us, and it brings enormous benefits, provided we handle it properly. I can think of nobody, we need that new narrative, but I think of nobody better prepared, better equipped essentially to provide some perspectives and stretch your minds on what the solutions to those challenges really might be than Michael Mulliton. Many of you will know Michael, I think, from the time he spent in Sydney. He's now based in Paris, but he spent 35 years involved at the sharp end, the innovative end of these issues. Initially as a scientist, subsequently in policy and in business at the highest level. He's been responsible for numerous innovations in the emissions trading, carbon trading, emissions reduction and global policy arenas. He's now the visiting professor, he has qualifications basically from Cambridge University, from Harvard, from the London School of Economics. He's now the visiting professor at l'Institut d'études politiques in Paris, or Sciences Po, as they say, along with the Paris School for International Affairs, as well as being the visiting professorial professor here at the Climate Change Research Institute at UNSW. So I'd really like to now turn it over to Michael to push your minds to the furthest extent possible.
Great. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Those of you that followed Ian's courageous challenge to join the board at BHP Billiton, I think if the board knew half of what was in this presentation, they'd realize just how valuable he's going to be when their energy division faces enormous stranded assets and big losses. We're going to move in that direction, and someone like Ian is going to be a huge asset for companies like BHP Billiton. Thank you for that introduction, Ian. I also want to take a second to thank the CCRC. As Ian mentioned, they've been kind enough to extend me a visiting professorial appointment there. It's really sort of how I've kept in touch with the science. But let me say, for those of you that don't know, and there's many people here from the Institute, Matthew England, Andy Pittman, Steve Sherwood, and the whole team there, they built something here in the last 8 or 9 years. They went from a startup to a world-class climate science research institute. They compete with the very biggest and best places on the planet. That's a world-class resource here. And when I'm in Paris and I read the New York Times, and Steve Sherwood is quoted in the New York Times, and just last month I was on a train reading The Economist, and Matthew England is quoted in The Economist, you begin to understand the breadth of their influence. So I just want to say kudos to the CCRC, and a special thanks to Alex Sengupta from the CCRC. This is my second public talk on climate change at UNSW, and he organized both of them. Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, what's this all about? Decarbonizing for growth. I attended COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, where we were, as you know, we were supposed to get a deal on climate change, and of course, we didn't get a deal. And I had a flight at the end of that conference from Copenhagen to London, Singapore, Sydney, because I was living here. And despite the fact that I don't speak the Prime Minister's Australian, I'm an Australian citizen. I became an Australian citizen. And Ian Dunlop, who's been here much longer than I have, is also an Australian citizen. So we're not parachuters. This is our adopted country. This is the country that we care most about. So my views are very passionate. They're very passionate about the future of Australia as well. So anyway, I've got a flight. I land in London, and there's a snowstorm, and there's not enough de-icing equipment. So I'm sitting on a plane for 7 hours waiting for the de-icing equipment. So it takes me 44 hours to get back to Sydney. Had a long time to think, 44 hours, right? End of the conference. And here's the takeaway message that kept entering my mind. Climate change, no one pays. That was the message, no one pays. Right? Because the conventional wisdom, and I'll get to this in the talk, the conventional wisdom is that if you're going to reduce carbon emissions, if you're going to invest in reducing carbon emissions, it means that in the future you're going to be a little poorer. Right? It's going to have an impact on growth in the future, and you have to agree that that action is going to make you a little bit poorer. That idea, right, as I'll show you, is what's been driving this to a race to the bottom, and the reason why, after almost 25 years of negotiations, we're not seeing much progress. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that with a fully connected world, and those of you with smartphones connected to the internet, you've got footy scores, you've got text messages, you've got pictures of your cat. And I realize that I've got to compete with that. So I make it easy. I just put the conclusion up front, right? So if you need to check on footy scores, all you really need to do is get through this slide. This is my thesis, right? We will decarbonize the global energy system not because we are sufficiently concerned about the risks of a climate system greatly modified by human activity, but because in the absence of this gigantic global infrastructure investment opportunity, right, we will never meet the economic growth targets required to fulfill the aspirations of a global population that will reach 9.5 billion by 2050. Right? That runs completely orthogonal to the conventional wisdom. Right? The conventional wisdom says you're going to be poor. I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm saying not only are you not going to be poor, if you don't do this, you're definitely going to be poor, and the only way to be wealthier in the future is to decarbonize the energy system. Let's see if I can make that stick. Okay, so those of you that have studied climate science, you would have seen this graph. This is CO2 emissions models and observations. So those straight colored lines going back to just before 2000 were attempts by several groups around the world to create scenarios for what emissions might happen in the future. Right? So that red line that you see in the very top line there is a pathway that has high carbon usage, low penetration of renewable energy, big explosions in economic growth, right? The kind of high carbon pathway. And the low one, of course, is one that assumes quicker penetration of renewables, maybe less demand for fossil fuels, a number of factors that would drive. And so those were the boundaries for the scenarios. The dotted line represents actual observed emissions. Right? So you don't need to read 2,000 pages in the IPCC's current AR5, Fifth Assessment Report. If you look at this graph, it tells you a very simple story. Emissions are tracking higher than were modeled, right, roughly 10 years ago. Okay? So this is my idea of a definitive climate change response failure. We've been negotiating 2 agreements under the United Nations auspices since 1990, Framework Convention on Climate Change in Kyoto. And over that entire period of time, and emissions are higher than what we projected them to be. Right? Okay. All right. So what's the conventional wisdom? I mentioned this, right? The conventional wisdom is reducing carbon emissions means agreeing to be a bit poor in the future. Reducing carbon emissions lowers future GDP growth. Right? And even the third assessment report, which just came out, says that in 2030 and 2050, we are going to be a little bit poor if we invest in reducing emissions. But good news is it's not very much. Don't worry. The problem with this being the prevailing narrative, the conventional wisdom, is that it leads to massive roadblocks in the negotiations. The first one is, and if you follow the negotiations, you know this term, common but differentiated responsibilities. And this is language that says that major developing countries like China and India, they're on the planet and they have to share some responsibility, but not the same responsibility as developed countries, right? So you know the Kyoto Protocol places obligations first on industrialized countries and then creates obligations, well, it's at some point in the future for these countries to join. If you think this is going to be expensive, right, then you're going to push for a deal like this, right? Because you don't want to be hit. You're trying to grow as fast as you can. If someone has told you this is going to be a constraint on growth, the last thing you want is a constraint on growth. You're going to push for a deal that gives you some kind of advantage. Second thing is, we do have carbon prices in place. The 28 countries in the EU have a carbon price. Right? British Columbia has a carbon price. California has a carbon price. We have one here in Australia. I don't know for how much longer, but we've got one. New Zealand's got one, right? But in all of those places where we have a regulated carbon price, the price is so low, right, that it doesn't motivate people to invest in the kind of structural changes that we need to shift onto a low carbon trajectory. When the prices are that low, people find ways of passing those costs on, right, to their customers or for getting free allowances, right? And the result is a little bit of pain with zero gain, right? And again, if you think that this is going to be expensive and you're a policymaker, the last thing you want to do is create leakage. That is, if you place a carbon price on your cement industry, right, and that causes their cement price to increase, and they decide to move away from your country to a country that doesn't have a carbon price on cement, right, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. Okay? Again, if you think it's going to be expensive, keep carbon prices low and protect yourself from leakage. And then, of course, push reduction timetables well into the future. Those of you that have been following this process, we have a meeting in Lima. Well, we have the Secretary General's high-level summit on climate change for heads of state, the 22nd and 23rd of September this year. Then we have COP20 in Lima, Peru this year. And of course, the big meeting, COP21 in Paris in December of 2015, where we're supposed to, like Copenhagen, the plan is we have to have an agreement in place. Right? But those of you that have been following this process know if we get an agreement, and of course that's a big if, the commitments to begin reducing emissions wouldn't begin until 2020. That's what the parties have already agreed to. If you ask these guys sitting in the front row from the CCRC about emissions pathways and trajectories, they'll tell you that we need to peak, emissions need to peak probably well before 2020 to have any hope of keeping temperature increases to safe levels. Right? But again, if you think this is going to be expensive, just push the timetable out as far as you can. Right? The result is, this is a race to the bottom. Right? This is a race to the bottom, and as I've written, a very, very strong disincentive for progress. Okay, so I decided, what if the conventional wisdom was wrong? These two characters, this guy here is Roger Revelle. Unfortunately, both these guys aren't with us anymore. And this smiling fellow here is Charles David Keeling. I'm honored to have had both of these guys as my mentors at the University of California. Now, Revelle, this crazy guy, in the 50s, the prevailing wisdom, right, the prevailing narrative, the conventional wisdom in the 1950s was the oceans had this enormous capacity to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? And it has roughly 40 to 50 times more carbon than the atmosphere. So it really didn't matter how much carbon humans emitted into the atmosphere, it would be drawn down into the oceans. Right? And those of you that have taken basic climate science know that, in fact, that's true. About 25% of the CO2 we emit gets absorbed into the oceans, 25% back into the terrestrial biosphere, onto land plants, and then about half of it remains in the atmosphere. But Revelle said, he's an ocean chemist, he said, there's some peculiarities about seawater chemistry. I don't think that's right. Right? And so he did the tests at sea with his colleague Hans Suess, and they had the audacity in 1957 to publish a paper that said the conventional wisdom is wrong. Right? That yes, the oceans will draw down some of this CO2 that we produce, but a large portion of it will accumulate in the atmosphere, and because CO2 has a long residence time, it stays in the atmosphere from centuries to millennia, it's going to accumulate. Right? What do you think the oil and gas industry, they hit Revelle pretty hard and said, no, come on, double your medication, you don't know what you're doing, right? I mean, he was absolutely pilloried, right? So Revelle said, okay, all right, I know I'm right, but if I'm right, then atmospheric CO2 concentrations have to be rising every year, right? So I'm going to hire this guy, a young postdoc from Caltech, in 1958, or about 57. We'll get this young guy down. He's a smart guy. We'll get him to measure atmospheric CO2, right? And if we're right, it has to be going up every year. So Keeling said, God, this is the easiest job in the world. I just pick up a catalog. I buy an atmospheric CO2 measuring device from some German or Swiss company that makes these things, right? Put them someplace and just start making measurements. That's my job. Well, the first thing he discovered is there is no instrument. There was no instrument in the 50s for measuring, accurately measuring CO2 in the atmosphere, so he had to build it. And the second thing is, once you built it, you had to figure out where to put it, right? Because if you put it in the middle of a city or someplace with a lot of industrial production with big carbon emissions, it was going to skew your data, right? So this crazy guy This is the famous Keeling curve, right? Which completely vindicates Keeling and Revell and Seuss's paper, right? And this is from the Mauna Loa, Hawaii, one of the 2 volcanoes on the Big Island of Hawaii, and the most remote place on Earth. If you look at the globe and you look at the Big Island of Hawaii and just take your finger and go to the largest population centers that you can, whether it's Tokyo or Los Angeles, in any direction, and you'll see that this is the most remote place on Earth. And that's where we put one device, and there was another device at the US Antarctic Research Station. And look at this, right? Those of you that follow this, that's the Keeling curve. So these 2 guys are the foundation of modern, or at least the most recent climate science. They challenged the conventional wisdom. And one of the things they instilled in, I think, everyone that they trained was, this is the essence of good science. This is the essence of being a good scientist. Challenge the prevailing wisdom. Challenge the conventional wisdom. So I said, this idea that reducing carbon is going to be expensive, let's challenge that. Okay, so you have to start looking at the dynamics of global economic growth to do that. Right? So one of the things that you find out very, very quickly is that, as I've written here, except for Syria, Somalia, Egypt, the Ukraine, and other countries facing major national security challenges at the moment, all other nations are pursuing one major objective above all others: promoting economic growth and jobs, right? As measured by GDP. Every president, every prime minister, every treasurer, finance minister, every CEO, every CFO, right? This is what they're doing 24/7, right? And it's not simple growth, right? We live on a planet that requires exponential growth, right? Why? Because, as I wrote, more people wanting more. You add more people, you have to feed them, and all the existing people you have, they want more than they had before, and the combination of that drives, right, an exponential system. Okay? So when you hear growth of 3%, obviously by definition, that's exponential. Okay? So that's the biggest force on the planet. That's why it's easy to understand why we don't make progress on climate change. Because if that's the greatest force on the planet, and everyone believes taking action on climate change is going to be expensive, then in fact you're running orthogonal, your climate change response is running orthogonal to the biggest force on the planet, right? Not hard to understand why we're not going to make progress under those circumstances. Okay, so then I said, all right, where are the sort of official GDP numbers, right? I hadn't started to question GDP as a metric yet, but I said, let's look at the numbers, right? So thank God my former employer, the OECD, put out this number. $305 trillion is what they are projecting global GDP needs to reach by 2050, right? And today, I wrote 2014, we're about 60 trillion. In 2010, we were about 55 trillion. In 1970, we were 18 trillion. So from 1970, in the 40 years that followed, right, we had a tripling of global economic output in 40 years. Pretty good result, right? That's a pretty good result. By the way, that's the biggest growth in human history. Right? But in the next 40-year period, right, that rate of growth has to double. Right? And it's just simple arithmetic in terms of people, right, and their demands, right, and how the system functions. Okay, the 305 trillion. The single biggest driver of that number are 2.5 billion new middle-class consumers that will be created between now and 2050. Most of those will be in Asia, but they will come from other areas around the world as well, the bulk of them in Asia. Those 2.5 billion people and the way that they spend their disposable income and the number of children they have are going to drive what happens on this planet between now and 2050. Okay, so now you've got a target number. So I said, all right, what might be the constraints to 305? Right? What might make it difficult to get the 305 trillion? So let's park climate change aside for a moment, right? And let's start with the first one, global debt. Right? So this is all debt. This is your credit card debt. This is student loans. This is mortgages. This is public debt. This is a debt by cities, by counties, by national government, sovereign debt. This is corporate debt. This is all the debt issued on debt capital markets, right? All of it. Right? The OECD number is 250 trillion, almost 250 trillion, racing towards that number, right? So if you're thinking about, if you're the global growth guru and your job is to take us from 60 to 305, here's your first problem. You've got 250 trillion in debt that has to be paid back, right? That's 4 years at today's level, right? So part of that has to, if you will, has to go backwards. Now, you might argue, like this hedge fund manager in Dallas, who thinks both France and Japan are going to default on their sovereign debt, that there may be some defaults. But of course, if we have large-scale defaults, that creates a whole different kettle of fish and a much bigger problem. Global productivity growth is declining. Right? So we got a couple of great boosts over the last 30 or 40 years. Here's the first one, right? Look at the number of women in this room. We moved women into jobs. Granted, we have probably a ways to go in terms of the number of women that are running major companies. But there are now, as you know, probably, there are more women in tertiary education than there are men, right? And we got a huge productivity increase. Now, we probably didn't actually get a huge productivity increase because all that domestic work that isn't measured by standard economic models is worth a ridiculous amount of money. And so probably the growth wasn't as big as that. But that was one trend. And of course, the technology. Right, all these technologies that we have that improve that. That growth in productivity is declining. Right? So this is a problem. The Productivity Commission in Australia is now looking at this, and there's a national conference to think about productivity growth in Australia. Aging global population and massive growth in retirees. Japan has a serious problem. Right? They're going to move the largest number of people into retirement over the next 10 to 12 years, and they'll have more people in retirement in 15 years than have ever been in retirement in Japan. Right? The United States is in a similar situation, not quite as many numbers, but they have a different problem. Their underfunded pensions, right, public pensions in the United States, $800 billion US. So part of the Ronald Reagan miracle was, when he was elected, was to allow companies to access their pension funds and borrow against those pension funds. As a result, lots of companies and cities and public pension funds are underfunded today to the tune of $800 billion. We're going to need growth, right? The amount of growth that you need, right, to cover that is not insignificant. Right? And those people are all going to move out, right? They're still going to consume, but in terms of productivity, there's going to be a bit of a drop-off there as well. Soaring global healthcare costs. I don't know if you've seen these numbers, but the WHO, chronic diseases, those costs are soaring everywhere. As a matter of fact, Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, and Vietnam have said they can no longer continue to support petrol subsidies, right? Keeping petrol prices low for their citizens because, one thing, soaring healthcare costs, they just don't have enough money. The oil price is high, right? Trying to subsidize people so they don't have to pay the world price or a market price for petrol, not a bad idea in surplus, but when you've got other soaring problems that are becoming more and more visible, it becomes a bit of a challenge. Okay, let's look at underinvestment in stationary energy. The IEA estimates that globally, the underinvestment in stationary energy, so power stations, transmission, distribution, all of that, is about 50 trillion out to 2030. In Australia, I don't know if you remember, but Martin Ferguson, the previous energy minister, put out a number and said Australian level investment is about 240 billion to 2030. Right? Now, that may not seem like a big number, but remember, the largest infrastructure project in history is the National Broadband Network, and that's about 40 billion. I don't know what would happen if you took Snowy Hydro and you brought those costs forward in terms of nominal dollars, but it's a huge number, right? Well, we moved from state-owned assets to private assets. The model changed, and the economic incentive to continue investing in infrastructure went away. And as a result, there's a huge amount of underinvestment, right? It's going to be a drag on growth. It's money. Well, it depends which way you go and what you invest in. Current global growth is well under 3%. 5% plus is required. Right? So right now, growth is way too low. Right? The United States and Europe, relatively flat. UK doing a little bit better. But globally, IMF says we're just below 3%. Rising fossil fuel prices, risks, and declining energy surpluses. Right? And I mentioned this point about Southeast Asian countries having difficulty continuing to subsidize consumption subsidies. But the real problem here, in my view, isn't the cost, it's the risks. Right? So look at BP and its Deepwater Horizon. Right? we've been operating in the Gulf of Mexico for 20, 30 years now. The level of risk that the company was exposed to was moderate, right? That mistake, right, that one mistake almost put them out of business. Right? And the level of risk on a project like that is nothing compared to the Arctic, ultra deep water off of Brazil and other locations. So the level of risk that these guys are exposing them to is unprecedented, right? To the point where you make a mistake and you might find yourself out of the Financial Times list of Fortune 500 companies. Okay, declining energy surpluses. This is something that doesn't get enough mention, right? Unless you're studying at a good place like UNSW, and you understand that the world doesn't work on energy. The world works on net energy, right? Because every single energy source that we use has to be converted, right? And has to be moved, right? And that process means that there's a certain amount of energy that you need, energy return on energy invested, right? The energy that you get out, right, requires increasingly now more and more energy, right? So that number is declining, and there are people who have attempted to calculate what the minimum sustainable energy return on energy invested is, and there are at least some parts of the literature that suggest that we're approaching that number. Constrained global food production, the FAO just last year said we hit a per capita peak in 2008 in terms of food production. I'm not a food expert, but clearly this is not just simply a distribution problem, and one that's going to constrain growth if we don't get on top of it. Now let's move back. I said let's park climate change. Let's move back. In 2011, the OECD issued this green growth report while I was there. And they said this. They said, reaching the 2050 GDP target, the 305 trillion, is impossible without immediately addressing a range of key environmental, those are degradation, I'll talk about that in a second, and natural resource depletion constraints. So we're separating environmental problems from ones where you're degrading something, right? So you pour dioxin into a river, those types of things where you're degrading something to the point where it can't be used or it's dangerous, right? As opposed to natural resource challenges where you're depleting something that's not going to return on a time scale meaningful to your needs, right? So the OECD says these challenges, if they're not addressed, they act as complete roadblocks to getting to 305. Right? And just those of you that follow this, if you can read these hieroglyphics, IPCC AR5, WG2, SPM, this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 5th Assessment Report, Working Group 2, Summary for Policymakers, because they produce a multi-thousand page report, and they produce a shorter report for policymakers with big pictures and big words. It makes it a little bit easier for them to navigate through. But this was just released, and they came out, this is released this year, they said that climate change is already slowing down growth. So places that are impacted by climate change and extreme weather events is already having an impact on slowing down growth. All right. But here's my favorite, right? Because we live in a world that has a single economic performance metric, GDP, gross domestic product, right? And when we talk about the cost of climate change, or the IPCC talks about the future cost of climate change, it's always in terms of a future decline in GDP in the future, right? So, those of you that have studied this will have known most of this, but this is a crazy metric, right? And it's almost useless for our purposes. First of all, it measures everything. Even negative welfare events is positive, right? So if you're an economy that has huge increase in divorce and violent crime and car accidents and type 2 diabetes and all those things increase GDP, right? Because they require expenditure, right, to correct. Right? That's all reflected positively in GDP. Second thing is it loves inefficient outcomes, right? And I put internal combustion vehicles there. Right? If you have to spend more money to get the same outcome, GDP loves that. Right? Because it's all about turnover. Right? So in fact, GDP prefers inefficient outcomes. I put internal combustion vehicles there. If you're reading some of the resource productivity literature on internal combustion vehicles, I mean, this is one of the greatest marketing projects of all time. Right? They've convinced us that we need the option value of having a car, and most of us, it's either the most expensive or the second most expensive thing that we buy, and we're using it less than 5% of the time. And the rate at which it converts the chemical energy and the fuel to making the car move is less than 10%. and when you subtract the weight of the vehicle, right, it's something like 1%. So it's the equivalent of saying every time you want to go someplace, you got to call 15 of your mates and take them with you, right? Because you have to move the weight of the vehicle as well. The model is wrong. The technology is completely wrong as well. GDP loves that, absolutely loves it, right? GDP says nothing about income wealth distribution. This guy, Thomas Piketty, he's at the Paris School of Economics, which is a sister organization, just published this book, Capital in the 21st Century. He's made the front page of almost every English language newspaper in the world, right? Because he said his research indicates that this idea that conservative governments like to not to tax individuals, reduce tax rates, because wealthy individuals, as they get wealthy, will invest more money, right, in building companies and putting people to work. He basically, I haven't read the book, but he basically blows a hole through that, right? And as a result, he's on the front page of all these newspapers. But GDP says nothing about that, because we use GDP per capita. So even though you've got, Gina Reinhardt with a disproportionate amount of Australia's wealth, you take a GDP per capita number, you spread her number across everybody, and we're all doing well. I don't think she'd be wildly enthusiastic about that idea. And then climate change costs based on lower GDP, right? So the IPCC's third assessment report, which just came out, said, as I said earlier, that there's a small decline in GDP. The good news is that if we take action on climate change, the decline in GDP is small. It's about 5% by 2050, right? Now, for most rational people, that's a good luck story. That's a great news story. It's only going to be 5%. But for politicians and the rest of the world, it's almost a disaster. Now, here's some crazy stuff going on. The governor of Vermont, the crazy governor of Vermont in the United States, right, was looking at the state's economic figures, right? And Vermont's GDP, like most states, has been moving on its way, nice trajectory upwards from 1950 to 2012. But he grew up and spent his whole life in Vermont, and his observation was, our GDP is going up, but we're not getting wealthier. As a matter of fact, it looks like we've been hovering flat. So he ordered, and the legislature passed a law requiring them to use a different metric, which is the GPI, or Genuine Progress Indicator. It's not a perfect metric. I'm not going to argue that this is going to solve everything, but it corrects a lot of the problems that GDP, right? So it actually looks at welfare as opposed to simply turnover. And they announced, and in fact, you can Google this, and you can find it on the states. The governor announced that their economy stopped growing in 1978. So that's their GDP line. That's GPI from 1978. What does that mean? It means that all the stuff that's driving GDP up must be, half of it is driving it up, and the other half is bringing it down, right? So we're pretty close to a balancing act, all those negative indicators, right? And then income distribution and debt as well. Now, Bob Costanza and a group of ecological economists, some based at ANU here in Australia, said, that's interesting. What if we applied the GPI to 17 of the G20 countries, right? They got the same result, and they published this paper last year, right? So if you Google this, Bob Costanza, I'm trying to remember who the lead author was, but if you Google that, you can find that paper. It's in the Journal of Ecological Economics, right? And they've got graphs, and Australia is included in one of the 17 countries, right? No growth, no growth. Interesting. Okay, so what's the upshot of all this? If you've got this crazy requirement to double the rate of growth, and you've got all these constraints, then you're not going to get there from here, right? You're going to need some new growth platforms, new growth engines that don't exist today, right? Big time. Because if you extrapolate up, right, on the low efficiency, high capital, high energy inefficient model, you get to about 170 at best. So if you're going to almost double that to 305, you need big time new growth engines. All right, let's explore this idea of growth engines, right? Look at Australia. Best performing OECD country in the last 15 years, and the one with the best growth prospects in the OECD. Everybody else is sucking gas, but we're humming along. Why? Well, we've got these exports of thermal coal, coking coal. We're going to be, if everything works out right, we're going to be the largest exporter of LNG. Of course, we've got iron ore and all this, and yellow cake and other things, right? We look really good, right? On a GDP model, we're looking pretty good. Federal Treasury, right, 18 months ago, Federal Treasury came out and said, we have a 30% growth deficit to 2030. Right? 30%. So the country with the best growth prospects out to 2030 has a gap of 30%. So if you, let me be clear what I'm saying. This is GDP of Australia today. This is Treasury's estimate of where we need to be in 2030. So if you take LNG and all these other things that we have and you push that out towards that number, you still have a gap of 30%. That's for the best performing country in the OECD. What does that say about everybody else? And then my friends at McKinsey, two McKinsey partners just released this book last month, right? They're now arguing that we're going to need substantial increases between 10 and 1,000 times in the efficiency with which capital, energy, water, and other resources are utilized. Right? Many large-scale economic activities their growth potential is so low, and in some cases, their net benefits are negative. Right? Coal-fired power generation is one of them. Large-scale beef production and internal combustion vehicles are three examples of that. Right? Many economic activities, as currently pursued, will not survive. And of course, this famous McKinsey curve, an idea of creative destruction. Right? Right? Growth is going to be disruptive. Right? So look at Airbnb, look at eBay, look at all these models. These companies that have done exceedingly well, they've exploited incredibly large inefficiencies. Right? We're just getting started with that. Right? I've got a 16-month-old daughter. I don't think she's going to ever own a vehicle. I think somebody else is going to own the vehicle, and she's going to have access to a vehicle, and she's certainly not going to drive an internal combustion vehicle. She's going to be driving a fuel cell vehicle or a battery electric vehicle. I'm quite certain of that. The model is going to change. The technology is going to change. And it's not because the old model produces a lot of waste, and that waste causes problems. It's because it's so economically inefficient, it won't scale. And if you continue down that pathway, right, you have zero chance of achieving the growth targets. Okay. All right. So where's the money? Where do you invest? Right? The IEA came out and said, we think the amount of money that you need to decarbonize the energy system above what the market is already moving. Right? So we've got wind farms in Australia. We've got solar installations on tops of homes. You know, there's a lot of things happening the market's already doing. The IEA is saying that on top of what the market is already moving, we need another $1 trillion per year on top of that. I think the order of magnitude is correct. I think the number is twice that. And the reason why is item 4 there. So what do you do with my $2 trillion per year, right? Oh, by the way, all 5 are essential, right? You've got to succeed in all 5 of these. The first one is improve the poor efficiency of the existing fossil system, right? And I'm going to switch to this next graph. How many people have seen this before? McKinsey marginal abatement cost curve. Okay. All right. This crazy graph, what did McKinsey do? They said, let's identify all the different opportunities there are to reduce carbon emissions, and let's put a price on them and cost them. That's what this thing does. So the vertical axis is euros per ton of carbon dioxide, right? And this is the horizontal axis is the total amount of carbon reduced, and out here it's 38 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, right? So almost all of our annual, a little less than all of our annual emissions today, okay? Now, what's this stuff over here, right? When you see a curve like this is negative cost abatement. Huh? Negative cost abatement? What does that mean? Look at this. I mean, you may not be able to read this, but this says lighting, switch incandescent to LED residential, right? And that's about minus 90 euros per ton, right? How does that work? It means that the amount of capital that you invest, right, to make that switch, the money that you save in terms of the energy efficiency improvements, right, yields a $90 back, 90 euros back to you, right? So that pool there, negative cost abatement, those are Milton Friedman's $100 bills on the ground, right? You know the story about Milton Friedman and his graduate student. They're walking down the sidewalk, and the graduate student says to Milton, there's a $100 bill on the ground. And Milton says, no, there isn't, because if it was there, somebody would have picked it up, right? Those are $100 bills sitting on the ground. That's negative cost abatement, right? So getting back to my list, right, why would you improve the efficiency of the existing system? Well, one is It's so insanely inefficient, there's such a large pool of negative cost abatement, that's a very good use of capital. Second of all, you're not going to make the transition overnight. So those highly inefficient systems that you've got in place are probably going to have to run a little bit longer. You need to make them as efficient as possible before you switch out of them, right? Okay. Second thing is expand existing commercial low-carbon solutions, right? The market's already doing this. We've seen explosion in investment in solar and wind, and it's great, and it has a huge growth rate, but on a timescale meaningful to both our growth demands and our climate change demands, that has to be accelerated. I move some of that money towards these existing commercial solutions. Third, accelerate proven but not yet at scale solutions. Battery electric cars. I got a chance to meet Carlos Ghosn. He's the CEO of Renault Nissan. And he came and spoke at Sciences Po last year. And he said, we had a faculty group with chat with him, and he said, we are incredibly bullish on electric cars for the simple reason that when we scale, they're going to be 40% less for us to build, right, on a comparative basis to a petrol car, and the operating costs are going to be half, right? These battery electric vehicles are going to take off not because they have tremendous environmental benefits. It's because the capital, energy, and resource efficiency is an order of magnitude better than what we're currently doing, right? And the current stuff that we're doing isn't going to scale. It's going to be a drag on growth. A lot more money there. Get that going faster. Now here's my most controversial and the one that I'm getting a lot of flack for, but I'm going to hold my ground. Pay the debt equity holders of high carbon assets for early closure. Right? So a French company, GDF Suez, owns one of the dirtiest coal-fired power plants in the world, Hazelwood in Victoria. It burns brown coal, right? It's a piece of junk. It's an absolute piece of junk, right? But if you add up all of the Hazelwoods around the world, there's so many of them, right? And they have enough operating life left in them that if you let them run, the amount of carbon that they're going to emit is, and that's this term lock-in, is something like, for the coal-fired power plants, about 50% of the remaining budget that we have to keep temperatures below 2 degrees, which is the target, right? So my view is those assets, there's two types of people who own them, right? There's the banks that loan the money, because these things are assets that are refinanced, and then there's the equity holders, the people who own the shares in the company that controls the asset. Write these people a check, tell them, shut the thing down. Oh, and by the way, we'll give you a premium if you invest that money in a new low carbon or zero carbon or exceedingly more efficient plant. But if you don't do this, it doesn't matter how successful you are with the other four. If you fail here, it really doesn't matter. We get completely swamped by the emissions from these existing assets. They're that large. Get rid of them. And by the way, in terms of that McKinsey marginal abatement cost curve, it's a really cheap abatement option relative to other options because they have such huge emissions going forward, right? And the cost of getting them out, if you can argue, like Carbon Tracker Initiative, that there's a carbon bubble and these assets are going to be rapidly depreciated, it's really an effective way of reducing carbon emissions. And then finally, invest much more capital in game changers. So artificial photosynthesis, integral fast reactors, synthetic biology, quantum computing. I spent about 6 months as the head of strategy for a company called Sky Energy. They're the world's largest aviation biofuel company. And we were looking at the technology pathways for aviation biofuels. And there are two processes that have been approved to make aviation biofuels for airlines. One is Fischer-Tropsch SPK, which is synthetic paraffinic kerosene, and the other one is bio-SPK. And we were looking about whether or not those were going to scale, and we rapidly came to the conclusion that they're not going to scale. For a variety of reasons. The amount of land that you need, the amount of water that you need, fertilizer, energy inputs, all of those kinds of things. So we started looking at all the other technologies going forward, and the last one, the furthest one out, right, is bugs to fuel, right? So there's a ridiculous amount of money chasing improvements in biomass. So get plants to produce more oil or more sugar, extract those sugars or extract those oils, put them in a modern refinery, bingo, and you start making fuel. But if you have to build 1,000 new refineries just to make enough additional jet fuel for airlines, it's not going to happen. So these guys, the guys at the top of the technology, right, the game changer guys are saying, we're not going to build 1,000 more refineries to make jet fuel. The market's never going to give us that money. right? Because we're not going to be able to develop a sufficiently robust proposition to the market to get that money out. We're going to genetically modify cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, and that bug isn't going to produce more oil, right? It's not going to produce sugar. It's going to secrete kerosene, right? They're doing it, right? So that's Airbnb, right? That's exactly the same thing as Airbnb, right? Exploit an insanely inefficient system, right? And jump and leapfrog. The next Googles, they're here. They're in this space, right? Artificial photosynthesis, there's a guy, Daniel Nocera, at MIT. I think he's now moved to Harvard, right? He's got an artificial leaf, put it in water, shine light on it. It secretes oxygen out one side, hydrogen out the other, right? With materials that are not rare earths, right? Not super expensive materials, right? That kind of stuff, right? That improves either capital, energy, or resource efficiency by 10-fold, 100-fold, in some cases 1,000-fold. That's where the next Googles are going to be. Now, we need these game changers for two reasons. One is the other four probably aren't going to get us enough reductions. And remember, we need about an 80% reduction by 2050. But after 2050, we have to go to zero. We have to go to zero. And it's likely, in my view, that the zero part after 2050 is going to have to come from this space. So it's a really good idea to invest in these now. One is you might make a ridiculous amount of money because if any of these guys get it right, they're going to crush the existing model. And two, we get that right, that's the technology that carries us because this global carbon management exercise is going to go on forever. Okay. All right. So I tell my students at Sciences Po, you want to study climate change? Great. But at the end of the day, this is a capital markets activation challenge, right? So I did a simple calculation. I said, okay, for last year, or I think this is for 2012, how much money does the market move towards low efficient, high carbon emitting assets? And how much does the market move towards highly efficient, low carbon emitting assets? And my definition for highly efficient, low carbon emitting assets are any technologies that put us on a scale and time scale relevant to the 2 degrees centigrade target, which is the target that governments have agreed to. Now, people like Jim Hansen in the United States are saying, no, it's not 450 ppm and 2 degrees, it's 350 ppm and 1 degree, and you know that we're at 400 ppm, so it means going backwards, which is another number that I calculated. The cost, and maybe Ian might like this number, the cost of reducing a single ppm is 1 trillion US. So we're at 400 ppm. If we decide that the target has to be 350, by the time we make that decision, we'll probably be at 420, right? That's $70 trillion going to go backwards, okay? So our 23-plus year approach has been, well, how do we shift this balance, right? This is, at the end of the day, this is what climate change is about, shifting the finance equation, right? Well, we tried this, right? We tried it by putting a price on carbon through the UN negotiation, through the EU ETS in California and Australia, right? And make that inefficient, high carbon emitting stuff, make it more expensive by putting a carbon price on it, and the market will then naturally will chase the more efficient, low carbon emitting stuff, right? Hasn't worked out for us, right? As I showed you on that slide, where our actual emissions are tracking higher than model emissions. So that's not going to, that doesn't seem to be happening on a scale meaningful to the problem. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, green bonds and climate bonds. I'm currently chairing the working group for the Climate Bonds Initiative in London. This is the fastest growing new debt asset class in history, these bonds. And it's the one bright spot. When people ask me, you've been watching this climate change experiment for 33 years now, are there any bright spots? This is a bright spot, and I'll talk about it more in a second. Okay, now, you said, all right, Moltor, you're talking about $2 trillion out of a global economy of 60. Okay, not a huge number relative to the size of the economy, but still, where's the money going to come from? All right. So, well, our plan A was put a price on carbon, and then the market will respond to that and shift carbon, but shift capital. But that didn't work. So the next answer is recognize. Plan B is recognize fundamental trends in the market and leverage them. Right? Okay. Institutional investors, pension funds, insurance, reinsurance, these companies, they control $83 trillion. Those AUM, assets under management. right? So your super is part of that, right? It's the biggest pool of capital on the planet, right? You want to do something interesting with money? Talk to these guys. If you can convince them, you've got something going, okay? They've got a problem, right? Their liabilities are increasing at the same time that the normal stuff they invest in is decreasing. Why is this stuff decreasing? Well, the last financial crisis, governments created new capital requirements on commercial banks. These are known as Basel II and Basel III. As a result of these new capital requirements, I mean, banks could leverage themselves. You know, when the Fed went into Bear Stearns and into, who's the other big firm that keeled over there? Lehman Brothers, right? These guys were leveraged 80 to 1, right? Could you imagine you went to your bank and you said, you know, I've got $1,000 in my bank account, loan me $86,000, right? So they've changed the leverage ratios, and as a result, right, commercial banks are completely have to get out of this space. So as a result, the amount of capital and the deals, right, and the stuff that these guys normally love to buy are decreasing. Right. So their need for greater returns is high. Pension funds, I mentioned earlier, we're moving the largest number of people in history into retirement. Right? So pension funds today, except for countries like Australia that have mandatory contributions, they're sweating it because their liabilities, they're about to see the largest number of people enter retirement, and the amount of money they're going to need to have on hand is so large that they're going to need to get higher returns. Okay. So currently, if you look at a super or you look at a pension fund like Storebrand in Norway, these guys typically only have about 1% of their portfolio invested in infrastructure. Why? Because that's not what they like to play in, right? They like to play in stable, you know, medium risk, low risk, nice steady cash flows, those types of things, right? And even less in green infrastructure. The climate bonds, green bond space is exploding because this investment trend towards green infrastructure is inevitable, right? These guys are moving into this space not because they woke up one day and said, oh my God, I'm green, I'm looking for green stuff. The normal stuff that they're buying is disappearing, right? And these things look like the stuff that they used to buy. But I'll talk more about that in a second. Okay. So I said this is the one bright spot. I got a chance to brief Connie Hedegaard. She's the EU Climate Action Commissioner in Paris about 2 months ago on this thesis about decarbonizing for growth. And she said to me, Michael, what are the bright spots? As policymakers, what do we need to do? I said, this is the most interesting thing I've seen, and the only thing I've seen that's happened in the 33 years I've been in this game that's happening on a scale, could happen on a scale meaningful to the problem, right? So ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, or SRI investing, has concentrated historically on equities, right? So if you wanted a green fund or a socially responsible fund, right, a fund manager would go out and create a screen, and they would invest in companies, tobacco, arms, you know, gambling, right? And they had ethical funds, right? But your money went to buy equities, right? You bought shares, you put money into a fund, and that fund invested in equities. And that market's been around for 25, 30 years. It's a small part of the total asset under management, but it's not insignificant. We've never had the equivalent on the debt side of the market. The result of the last financial crisis is we went from a world before the crisis dominated by equities, with bonds being second best, so now the bond market is significantly larger than the equities market, right? So bonds, the debt side of the equation, is the big side of town now. Okay, so and it's worth $100 trillion. Again, the kind of number that, you know, gets you up in the morning and wants you to go to work. New bonds. Okay, these bonds were launched by the World Bank and by the IFC and by the European Investment Bank in 2008, right? So these guys, they're AAA rated. Right? These institutions are AAA rating. And they use their AAA rating, their highest credit rating, right, to raise money. And because they have a AAA rating, institutional investors love to invest in things that they put out. So they issue debt. So the World Bank issues a green bond, and it uses 100% of the proceeds for wastewater treatment plants, solar PV, you know, all these things in the space that I was talking about before. Right? And who's buying it? Pension funds, large institutional investors. Why? Because it has, not because it's green, because it has the right risk-adjusted returns, right? These guys, they chase risk-adjusted returns, and these bonds look really good from that perspective. All right, so last year, the total issuances of both by development banks and by corporates was about 12 billion, right? We did the same amount in the first quarter of this year, and Bank of America Merrill Lynch estimates by 2016 the market will be 400 billion. Now we're starting to get close to that trillion, 2 trillion number quickly, right? But here's the interesting thing. There's no premium yet on the green or climate credentials. That is, these institutional investors are buying these bonds because they look like the things they used to buy, right? Same risk-adjusted returns. What happens when the market assigns some kind of premium, either through regulation or by the market identifying these risks? If that premium were just tiny, and Connie Hedegaard asked me, give me an idea, I said, make them tax-free in Europe. Make the income from them tax-free in Europe, right? Municipal bonds in the United States, the income is tax-free. Now, of course, the market corrects the coupon or the payment based on the fact that they're tax-free, but still, you tweak them just a little bit, and instead of 400 billion in 2016, we're rapidly approaching $1 trillion, possibly, right? But at some point, the market's going to recognize these risks, and these bonds are going to have an added premium associated to them. When that happens, game over. Okay, so where are we? This is not a game being played by 3 guys in a garage. 25 of the world's biggest banks signed the green bonds principle. That's Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Citigroup, BNP Paribas, name any large bank and they're on that list, right? Why are they doing this? They ain't green. They ain't green, right? This is a new asset class, right? And those institutional investors, they're like God. You have those guys as clients, they have God. And if they say we want to buy these bonds, then by God, we're going to create a team and we're going to start issuing these damn things, right? So BNP Paribas has a team in London now, and they're racing to get into this market. These bonds are 2 to 9 times oversubscribed by institutional investors. That's the number of people who want to buy them, right, is significantly larger than what's on offer, right? So they're in very, very high demand. Now, part of that is due to the fact that the bond market right now is very, very strong, right? So bonds are doing well generally. But it's interesting that in the absence of a premium, a green premium, they're still oversubscribed. And I just thought I'd throw this in because I got an email just last week. The World Bank issued a $300 million kangaroo green bond. Now, a kangaroo green bond isn't one that invests in kangaroos. It's one denominated in Australian dollars. Right? It's a $300 million Australian dollar bond, right? And UniSuper, how many people have their money in UniSuper? They're super with Uni. Good on you. UniSuper bought 100 million, right? They took up a third of this issue. That bond, right, will fund carbon reduction projects, right? Super efficient, low carbon, highly efficient projects around the world. Okay. Now, let's go back to plan A, right? Because we can hope that the market sees this risk and prices this risk and sees the opportunity. But let's be honest, if we had government intervention, right, we'd be a lot better off, right? So plan A was, get some savvy government to put a real carbon price in place and then change the equation. The key to this thing, and the key with climate bonds, is getting to a liquidity threshold, right? These big guys, they only play when you have a very large and liquid market. And the faster you achieve that liquidity threshold, the better. If you get a government-mandated carbon price, right, it certainly helps drive this thing faster. The question is, we'll probably do it without a government-mandated carbon price. The only question is, will we do it fast enough relative to the opportunity and to our climate challenge? Right? Okay, so this crazy Australian carbon tax, I don't know where we are on there's certain experts in here, started at $23 and sort of ratcheting its way up, right, per ton of CO2e. By the way, my point about leakage and regulated carbon prices not being robust, I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers. Right? We were hired by the Australian government. They wanted to know what was the key number, right? At what price per ton would we see the biggest change in terms of a shift, in terms of structural change? We gave them a number, $41, right? They said, thank you, here's your check, right? $23 is the tax, right? At $41, you start to approach things like fuel switching coal-fired power plants to gas, right? But again, if you think this is going to be expensive, right, then like every other government in the world that has a carbon price, you're going to keep your price well below that sort of key number that would drive meaningful structural change. All right. Now, this thing generated, and there's experts in the room that probably have these figures better than I do, but my numbers are about $7 billion in revenue And here's the amazing thing. Reserve Bank of Australia said the inflationary impact of that, right, was 0.02%, right? So fantastic way, pretty efficient way of taking money out of the economy, depending on what you do with it. Well, some revenue was earmarked to compensate low-income households. I don't know if that actually happens. Maybe somebody else can bring that up in question time. Some revenue to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, right? The Clean Energy Finance Corporation is an unbelievably good idea if you think I'm even half right, right? Because what are they doing? They're investing in those 5 things, right? Not all 5 of those things, but they are investing in things on that list. That's their mandate. It's an incredibly good idea if you think this is a race to the top. If you think it's a race to the bottom, then in fact you're the Abbott government. You scrap it in a second. Okay. The large emitters, now the Treasury announced that the large emitters, right, who had a liability to pay the tax, they actually saved money, right? Because they hired consultants and they said, look, you need to improve your energy efficiency. That's the way. They improved their energy efficiency, and in fact, they made money, right? So this idea that the economy was going to collapse with a carbon price, wrong, right? And that's largely because of that marginal abatement cost curve. A lot of these guys are really inefficient with energy, and just improving that lowers carbon emissions, improves your energy efficiency, improves your bottom line. Pretty straightforward. And then the question I ask is, what about filling in that 30% gap, right? If we have a 30% gap in terms of wealth, in terms of where we need to be by 2030, maybe we get there by dramatically improving efficiency, right? Moving into these new sectors and these new opportunities. Oh, by the way, Australian federal government budget shortfall is somewhere around 20+ billion. So while you're sitting around trying to figure out what to do, you've got $7 billion coming in every year with virtually no inflationary impact. Probably not a bad idea to sit around and just wait for a while. Okay, here's my last slide. Before I left Paris, that was the headline in the Financial Times. Australia's luck runs out as China slows down. Okay, so and maybe we can get into this in the questions, right? If our GPI tells us that we've been flat in terms of real growth since the late 70s, early 80s in Australia, then the first question is, here for us, where does real growth come from? And when I mean real growth, I don't mean GDP growth. I mean growth that's worth having. Second, when do we start to invest in the future? Right? The CFC is a very, very good start. Right? Where do we start to invest? Right? And I wrote a bigger role for the CCFC. And then car manufacturing. We're losing car manufacturing. Right? We're not making jet fuel anymore. When the last refinery closes, we're going to import 100% of our jet fuel from Singapore. So we're going to import cars. Right? But if we move to electric vehicles, right, we've got a lot of really smart people who are design experts. And some of these companies are keeping the Australian design groups here. Right? Look at the Apple model. Right? World's most valuable company. Right? What's their model? They don't make anything. Right? They're a design shop, right? And they outsource the production. Right? I don't know. I'm not the prime minister. I'm not the innovation minister. But we've got a lot of very smart people who know how to design vehicles. Right? I guarantee you, we're going to be importing. You're going to see the BMW i3. You're going to see, well, I think the Leaf might already be here. You're going to see these electric vehicles, and you're going to see even fuel cell vehicles start pouring out next year. We're going to be importing 100% of them. Right? Now, we're not a big enough country to support the entire value chain to make cars ourselves, but isn't there a better model? I mean, the world's going to move away from this insanely stupid model that you spend all this money on something that you only use 5% of the time, you pay for it 100% of the time, right? Its value declines, the price of fuel keeps going up, right? That model's going to change. Somebody like those 2 clever guys that started Airbnb are going to create a new model, right? It's not a genius, right, to figure this out. You don't need to be a genius. We made a transition from fixed line telephony to mobile telephony. Right? And we exported all of our cash to do that because we didn't have a domestic industry making most of this stuff. Do we want to make that mistake again? Right? And isn't this the basis of growth? I'll leave it at that, and I'll be happy to answer some questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, while Michael catches his breath. Questions? Please put your hands up. I'll try and keep an order on you. And do identify yourself and try and make it a short and sweet question.
Alan Aaron's my name. I like your 5 opportunities. I tend to question your 4th one, which is paying, particularly well-depreciated asset owners to shut down. Why would you take that politically unpopular step of subsidising or nationalising the cost of these guys, rather than regulating their output and forcing the equity owners to take a haircut, notwithstanding the concerns about sovereign risk, which really isn't true, because these assets are way depreciated anyway?
Well, I agree with you. If you thought it was politically possible, right, to place a sufficiently robust carbon price to accelerate and depreciate these assets so these guys would walk away from them anyway, more power to you. But we've been trying that for at least 25 years.
Carbon price. Why not just regulate emissions?
Well, this is what...
For certain groups of emitters.
This is what Obama's trying to do, right? And he's going to find himself, he's got the Koch brothers, the billionaire Koch brothers, right, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into every political race in the midterm elections this year, right? And this is exactly what he's trying to do. He's outrunning, so he doesn't need Congress because he has authority under the Clean Air Act to do that, right? But as soon as they issue those regulations, they're going to be sued. They're going to be in federal court. I mean, I agree with you. It's much more efficient to either adopt regulations, right, that depreciate these assets than my option. But I haven't seen anything in my entire time that suggests that politicians have any appetite for that. Right? Quite the opposite, right? That's why I'm left with, and while we're waiting for that to happen, and I think that will eventually happen, but will it happen on a timescale meaningful to improving efficiency and reducing those emissions? That's the ultimate question. I don't think we can wait for these guys to figure this out, right? I would rather just step in there, right? Find a way to create a sufficiently robust value proposition and pay these guys to walk away. Right? I mean, it might very well be that the market, in the absence of regulation, prices this risk, right? Which would be fantastic. Because this is what the market does all the time. Identifies risks, price that market does all the time. Identifies risks, price that risk, right? And allocates resources on a risk-adjusted basis.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Veronica Menendez. I used to do climate policy for the New South Wales government. I'm just interested in what you're saying about the pension funds and superannuation. Australia has this massive pool of pension funds for our size because of compulsory super. How much do you think that could be a driver for the kind of green bonds and that sort of green investment that you're talking about? Like, could it be that Australia is perhaps going to be a leader in that field because of compulsory super?
Yeah, absolutely. So did everybody hear the question about Australian super? So our super is about, correct me if I'm wrong, about 1.6 trillion for a country with 23 million people. So I think we're the 4th largest pension market in the world as a result of compulsory super, right? Which is a fantastic thing. I know that Vic Super, Uni Super, Catholic Super, these are very, very progressive supers that have figured a lot of this out. They have made announcements about increasing their exposure to infrastructure, right, and green infrastructure. And they're looking at, I mean, the most progressive pension funds in terms of getting this are Pensions Denmark, Storebrand in Norway. Storebrand in Norway came out and said, we're going to have 20% of our portfolio in green infrastructure. Right? So yes, you're absolutely right. This is an area where we could absolutely dominate, And we have good forward-thinking supers. The question is, could we get some regulatory help, right? Some market help? I mean, how do we take our comparative advantage in superannuation, right, and leverage that to accelerate this and put us? I mean, it gets back to my questions about when do we invest in the future? How do we invest, right? My argument to super funds, to pension funds, is, look, your liabilities are rising so quickly that before you never try to hit a 6, right? Pardon my cricket, right? Just get out there and knock out a couple 1s and 2s, you were fine. But now your liabilities are so high, every once in a while you got to step up there and try to hit a 6, right? This is your hit a 6 space, right? Especially in the game-changing space. And so Warburg Pincus and others are now moving, there are several funds now that are investing exclusively in that game changer space. Yes, absolutely, we should be doing that here, right? And I put sovereign wealth fund as the last thing on the list, right? We ought to be moving and doing what the Norwegians did, right? With their, now the world's largest sovereign wealth fund.
Down here. Yes.
Hi, Sian Green. I just wonder, with the bonds, like all that bond issuing, the World Bank issuing bonds, how do they pay them back? The people who invest, how do they pay back?
Yeah, well, they create an asset, right? So it's an asset that generates revenue, and that revenue is what's used to pay back the bond.
Yeah, obviously, but how does the revenue? So I imagine there's lots of little people in India or somewhere offsetting, you know, they're investing in efficient stuff. How does that pay? I guess that's what I'm...
Oh, so are you concerned about the fact that about commercial conditions, about whether or not you can make money because people can't afford to pay?
Or sort of. I'm sort of saying the World Bank, they're a AAA, you know, they've got a AAA rating. They go, we're going to, you know, borrow some money from you guys. We're going to put it in energy efficiency or whatever. I'm just sort of... Okay, so I'll answer that question this way. I'll answer the question this way. There was a Chinese delegation that came to the IEA, the International Energy Agency in Paris, about 2 months ago, and I was fortunate to get a chance to meet with them. And they're the team that's working on the energy part of the next 5-year plan. And they said something quite startling. They said, look, we made a mistake. When we started our development, we took the Western model, super capital intensive, energy inefficient, right? And it led us to think that things like coal were the cheapest, right? But if you factor in all of the costs of coal, right, including their, especially in China, the healthcare costs, right, coal becomes the world's most expensive. Right? So if you start to change that mindset, right, then in fact those cleaner, those cleaner assets are in fact cheaper. Right? It's like people who buy, you know, I remember I had Good Guys, working for Good Guys as a client, and they have all these washing machines. You know, you can spend $200 on a washing machine, or you can spend $8,000 on a washing machine, right? The cheapest one's not the $200 one, right? So that would be part of my explanation in terms of the fact that in many of these places, they recognize that using GDP and using poor metrics to value these things is incorrect. And it's the more expensive options that are actually cheaper, if you will. But you still got to get real money somewhere back to the person.
Yeah, but remember, but the World Bank's AAA rated, right? And the reason they're AAA rated is that they pay back, right? So if you're the investor, you don't need to do a whole lot of due diligence. You're backstopped.
The GFC came around, sort of, but...
Sorry, unless another GFC comes around.
No, that's how the GFC came around, kind of. Like, you know, people had lots of AAA rated stuff that, you know, they put out and they were really checked and la 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 and whatever. It's just, you know, it's interesting because we know that it's a lower, you know, of course it's cheaper on the long term to buy $800, but if I buy my $800 washing machine, somehow I've still got to give some real money back to you somehow.
Yeah, but if you're Malaysia or Indonesia or Cambodia and you can't afford any more consumption subsidies for petrol, right? Then in fact the investing in building or buying, you know, fuel efficient vehicles or battery electric vehicles is much more attractive. But you're right, you need to aggregate in many of these places where you're investing, right? Yeah, you need to have that cash flow, right? You need to have those customers, they need to pay back. World Bank's obviously very good at finding projects that have stable long-term cash flows. That's why they can keep their AAA rating.
Michael, Freddie Sharp, thanks for another great presentation. Can I explore what might be an inherent paradox in the analysis? Because it's predicated upon the fact that GDP needs to grow fivefold by 2050, but GDP is an inherently flawed measure of economic activity. And your premise is that the existing economic model can't possibly grow fivefold by 2050, so we need to have a different model. If you applied GPI, another measure, to ascertain how much economic growth we really need to achieve, is it really fivefold? It may be a simple doubling or a 10% growth. Are your conclusions the same if you measure economic activity in a sensible way, not a sort of stupid way as GDP requires you to do? And would your conclusions be the same? Would the results be the same?
Yeah, I mean, Freddie, great question. Look, no, I mean, I think GPI, if you use real metrics, right, and judge things that matter, then in fact you don't need fivefold. Plus, let's be honest, I'm going to go off the record and say I don't think there's any chance we're ever going to get the 305, regardless of what we do, right? There are certain constraints that are going to keep us from that. But I'm trying to play in this part of this crazy world game in terms of the wrong metrics, right? Is if the reason we're not taking action on climate change is because it runs orthogonal to our growth, right? Then if you're going to win on that argument, again, on a timescale meaningful to solving this thing, you have to leverage part of that crazy, stupid argument, right? And you have to show them, right? You have to show those men and women that sit around the prime ministers and presidents, right, that this is their pathway to growth, for France, for example, right? So you can't simply say, well, it's not the OECD 305, it's GPI, and it's, it's 140, right? Or a lower number. So part of what I'm doing is, yes, I'm undermining part of my own argument, but part of what I'm doing is because we have such a short period of time, as you know very well, the steepness of that decarbonization curve is now so sharp. We have a short period of time. We need to get action. So appeal to the greatest force on the planet, right, and get them and get the people with the most amount of money moving in this direction. And unfortunately, to do that, you've got to play, this is part of the playing the game, and that is you've got to play this growth. Personally, if you ask me off the record, I think 305 is a crazy number.
I should say you are being recorded here, Mark. Other questions? In front of you.
Michael, just to follow on to Freddie's comment. I mean, I know you kept away from climate as much as you could and stuck to the economic argument. But you still hinge around the 2 degrees C objective and so on. I mean, if you actually look at the carbon tracker work, everybody says we can only burn 20% of global fossil fuel reserves, proven reserves, to stay below that 2 degrees C. That's assuming something like a 50 to 60% chance of actually achieving it. If you actually look at the latest science, you actually have no carbon budget left if you take a reasonable chance of, say, something like 10%. I suspect that that's actually going to kick in a physical sense over the next decade or so. So the context in which you're doing this is actually going to change too. And I just wondered, I mean, once you get to that point, I know all the problems of getting anybody to change anything and the points about, the most efficient ways of doing it. But how does this scale up, do you think? If you actually got to the point of accepting you didn't actually have a carbon budget any longer, and you really were going to have to move into sort of emergency response.
Yeah. Did everyone get that, the question? It's the targets and the carbon budget that we're talking about is expressed in terms of relative probability, right? So the 1,000 gigaton number that the IPCC and Meinhausen, this sort of key paper talk about, if you keep under a certain number, it only gives you a 50% probability or a between 20 and 50% probability of achieving the target. So Ian's point is that if you want to increase those odds, right, of not going beyond 2C, then in fact the carbon budget that you have is significantly smaller, almost zero, right? So the question is how fast, right? If that's true, and we only have virtually no carbon budget, then how fast can you scale this? Well, one of the other reasons I didn't mention about buying out those assets is that one of the things that keeps you from scaling renewables apart from, let's say, some energy storage issues, which are not insignificant, is the fact that there isn't enough additional capacity online to allow them to scale liquidity. So the other advantage that you get from shutting down those coal-fired assets, for example, is you leave additional, much more room, right, for those things to scale. Now, Stephen Chu, Nobel laureate and outgoing US energy secretary, said normally these major energy transitions take 50 years, right? So we certainly don't have 50 years based on if we have some carbon budget or no carbon budget, right? But that 50 years is because we hang on to the incumbents as long as we possibly can, right? And the transition takes longer, right? So, I mean, if your model of the world predicted the last financial crisis or the devaluation of the Mexican peso or any of the other major events, then, I'm more than happy to talk to you. But about predicting what might happen in the future, But Ian's right. I mean, let's be honest, those 5 things I mentioned, not only do we need to be successful in them, we need to be unbelievably successful. In fact, more successful than we've ever been in investing in anything else, right? That's with the carbon budget, right? That's with a little bit of a carbon budget. Without the carbon budget, things become even more problematic. So, and then of course, Jim Hansen is saying 350, and climate sensitivity 350. Then you're not talking about additional emissions, you're talking about going backwards. So, yeah, I mean, let's be honest, people. This is the only way we're going to do it, right? But Ian has a very valid point. The steepness of the challenge is very, very great, and we would need an absolutely unprecedented response right here, from both on the policy side and on the market side. I shouldn't overstate that or understate that.
Do you have any more questions? Okay, we might have to make this the last one, so I hope it's a good one.
Harley Wright, I'm a climate tragic like Ian. You mentioned the Mainshausen carbon budget, 1,000 gigatons of CO2 that we're going to emit. And I'm a great fan of contraction and convergence. Would you care to comment on that and how maybe at the Paris COP in next year that we could get a global agreement to share the carbon budget of 1,000 gigatons fairly between all countries, and what that might mean in terms of trading, especially under contraction and convergence, where the poor countries, low carbon countries, have relatively low emissions and can sell all their excess permits to the gluttonous carbon emitters like Australia.
Yeah, so I don't know how many of you heard the question. Very interesting question. So there's this idea that's been around for a while that ultimately what we need is contraction and convergence. That is that that we need to, per capita emissions are very high in industrialized countries, they're very low in developing countries, and so we need contraction, we need to bring those so that they converge, right, contract and converge, right? So we need India's per capita emissions to increase, right, while Australia's and Bahrain and the US and Canada decrease. And so if you take this idea that it's no longer annual emissions that are important, so it's not the shape of the curve that matters as much as the total area under the curve, right? So that there's a total amount of allowable carbon that we can emit to protect ourselves from dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, to use the UNFCCC's. So this gentleman's interesting question is, what if we shifted in negotiations towards contraction and convergence, right? We picked a number in terms of the total amount of emissions, right? And we allocated those to countries. And so poor countries could either use them, right, on a high carbon pathway and use their allowance to emit more, or they could take a low carbon pathway and sell their allowances to countries, right, that want an increase. Right? I mean, fantastic idea, right? Politically, unfortunately, near zero. I mean, the French government team organizing COP21, they are horrified at the prospect that if we do not see enough progress in Lima this year, that the parties may agree to shift the key conference from 2015 to 2016 to COP22. That makes Paris a lame duck conference and makes Francois Hollande's re-election chances probably go to zero. So the opportunity to introduce a new idea, even a great idea like this, at this stage of the game, my personal view, politically very, 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 very difficult. I mean, there are other interesting examples, other ways to do this, but numerous governments have already said we have zero interest in moving the discussions towards an allocation of the remaining budget. Again, if you think this is going to be expensive, not hard to imagine that you would refuse to get into a negotiation to allocate some remaining budget.
Closing remarks? Yeah. No worries. Okay, please join me again in thanking Michael.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm not even going to try and summarise that. There's a lot of ideas. We can make the presentation available up on the CCRC website and others, no doubt. There's also a background paper, which is that also something we can distribute?
Yes.
So that's an opportunity to explore these ideas in more detail. I'll make just perhaps a few sort of closing thoughts on this. And, you know, that Michael started with the challenge to conventional wisdom, and I think that is very important right now. Conventional wisdom is not serving us well in this space. The challenge of climate change, and if you just want to put it in an economics framework, I should note the latest IPCC report has a chapter now on ethics and economics of climate change. About time that got more attention. But I'd certainly urge caution for some of the IPCC's work led by Professor Richard Cole on the damage costs of unchecked climate change. We are facing, as Ian and others have raised, the potential for catastrophic damage to the economy, but far more than that. On the opportunity side, and I think the point was made over here, yes, market opportunities, but governments still frame those. Governments can still shut down Uber and Airbnb, and incumbents are trying to get them to do it. And to the extent you've still got to implement projects that make money, the government's role in creating a favourable environment cannot be underestimated. And then for capital markets, you made the point, you tell your students, the challenge is one of capital market motivation. It's important to realise a lot of public around the world aren't particularly pleased with capital markets right now. They disgrace themselves in the global financial crisis, greedy and incompetent. But there is an opportunity for them to do some good. And the Clean Energy Finance Corporation here in Australia, I think, is a great example of what can be done. It's certainly worth looking at what they've been up to. Please join me again in thanking Michael and also Ian Dunlop.